We sided with my wife's younger sister, after she slept with my brother. That's the sentence I never thought I'd have to write, let alone live. My brother has been gone for nearly 2 years now. Not dead, just gone. Somewhere in Vancouver, 3,000 kilometers away, building a life we'll never see the inside of. The family trust our grandfather spent 60 years building on a grain farm. Outside Moose Jaw. $1.1 million. It quietly existed while none of us ever thought to ask about it. Has been redirected to 3 charities and a student bursary at the University of Saskatchewan. My wife's sister is in a small apartment across the river now, slowly putting herself back together one cafe shift at a time. And I am the man who made all of it possible. By opening my mouth when I should have kept it shut. My brother Maxwell is 4 years older than me. Growing up in Regina, he was the kind of kid who made everything look effortless. Straight A's without appearing to try, provincial attraction champion in grade 11, a university scholarship he almost turned down, because he wasn't sure he wanted to leave Saskatchewan yet. He eventually went to the University of Calgary for civil engineering, stayed in Alberta, worked his way up at an infrastructure consulting firm. By the time he was 38, he was a senior project engineer, designing bridge rehabilitation projects across Western Canada. He owned a condo in Beltline, drove a sensible Subaru, and made it home to mom and dad in Regina every Thanksgiving without needing to be reminded. He never bragged about any of it. That was always the thing about Maxwell. He just quietly did the work. And quietly lived the results. And if you weren't paying attention, you might not notice how far ahead of the rest of us he'd got. My wife Josephine, Joe, always Joe, has a younger sister named Daphne. 6 years between them, never particularly close but never estranged either. Just sisters who'd grown up in the same house and ended up leading separate lives. Daphne had dropped out of a graphic design program at Mount Royal partway through second year, spent a season working hospitality jobs in Banff, and came back to Calgary that autumn, saying she needed to figure out what she actually wanted. Joe and I had the space. We'd bought a semi-detached in Renfrew 2 years before. Nothing's spectacular, with a finished basement and a spare room we hadn't found a purpose for. We told Daphne she could stay while she sorted herself out. She'd help with groceries and cleaning in lieu of rent. Temporary, we all agreed. That word does a lot of heavy lifting in families. Maxwell came into the picture that February. His firm had won a contract with the city of Calgary on a major bridge project. And rather than pay corporate housing rates for 6 months, he called to see if the spare room was still available. Daphne had moved down to the basement by then. The spare room was free. Of course, we said. It made sense all around. Those first weeks were easy. Maxwell left before 7 most mornings. Often wasn't back until 8 or 9 at night. Daphne was job hunting, picking up small freelance contracts for local businesses needing logo work, spending most of the day at the kitchen table with her laptop. Joe was commuting downtown to her HR position. I was working out of the home office most days, managing project timelines for a construction software company. I was 36 years old and I thought I understood my family pretty well. We had Sunday dinners. We watched the playoffs. Maxwell would stop by the Tim Hortons near his office and come home with 4 double-doubles without being asked, like it was just what you did. Everything seemed straightforward. By April, Joe mentioned that Daphne and Maxwell had started having lunch together a couple of times a week. When he could get away from the office. She said it the way you say something nice. They were getting along. Daphne seemed to be coming out of the fog she'd been in. Wasn't it good they had company for each other during the day? I didn't think anything of it. Maxwell had always been easy to be around, the kind of person who made strangers feel immediately comfortable. Without seeming to try. I didn't start reading it differently until one evening in May when I came downstairs for a glass of water. After midnight, and the kitchen light was still on, I could hear the two of them talking quietly at the counter. Daphne's laptop opened between them, both of them laughing at something that was clearly only funny to the two of them. The particular quiet of it. I went back upstairs and told myself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Maxwell knocked on my home office door, on a Wednesday evening in early July. Joe was at a work function downtown. Daphne had gone out for the evening. He asked if I had a few minutes. I'd saved my file, turned around and knew from looking at his face that whatever was about to happen was not going to be easy. He sat in the chair across from my desk and put his hands together and looked at them for a moment. Before he looked at me. I need to tell you what's been happening, he said, and I need you to know I ended it last week. That part is done. 4 months. It had started with lunches, then longer conversations when they were both home during the day. Then more than that. His voice stayed completely level the entire time he talked. He said he knew it was wrong. He said he wasn't making excuses. He was telling me because I had the right to know what had happened in my own house, and because he intended to finish the last 3 weeks of his contract and leave. And he didn't want to leave without being honest with me first. I didn't say anything for a long time. Does Joe know? I asked. Not from me. I thought that was your conversation. He left the room. I sat there staring at my monitor, which had gone to screensaver, turning it all over. 4 months my brother, my wife's sister, under our roof, while I worked 15 meters away. Joe came home around 10, I told her. She went quiet in a way I'd only seen once before, at her mother's funeral. Then she called Daphne. Here is the part I return to most. The part that, if I had any ability to reach back and shake myself by the collar, I would change completely. Daphne came home within 20 minutes. She'd been crying before she walked through the door. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at both of us and said, before either of us could speak, that she was sorry. She didn't know how to explain it. It had just happened and she hadn't wanted it to, not exactly, and she knew that wasn't good enough. But she didn't know what else to say. Joe looked at her sister for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I'd like to say I waited carefully. What actually happened is that I looked at Daphne, 24 years old, sitting at our kitchen table, crying. And I thought about the version of this where we asked her to leave. What that looked like, Christmas. Joe's parents' next dinner, the particular absence that would sit at the table, if we chose that. And I flinched from it. You were both adults, Joe said finally. These things are complicated. We're not throwing anyone out, I added, but it's done. We move forward. I said it like I was managing a workplace conflict, like I was the calm, sensible one. We didn't tell Maxwell what we'd said to Daphne. We didn't tell him much of anything. Joe knocked on the guest room door later that evening and told him we'd spoken to her sister, and we thought the best thing, for everyone, was to get through the rest of his contract without any drama. She hoped he understood. Sure, he said. I understand. The same flat voice he'd used in my office. The voice that, I understand now, means I'm done here. Maxwell finished his 3 remaining weeks. He was polite at dinner, responsive when you spoke to him, and completely absent in every way that actually mattered. When the contract ended, he told us his firm had offered him a position in their Vancouver office, and he'd accepted. He was moving at the end of August. He thanked us for the room, handed Joe a check for what he said was fair market rate for 6 months of accommodation. We hadn't asked him for anything, and then he left. I thought he needed time. People who are good at handling things eventually handle things. That had always been Maxwell. I'd watched him do it his entire life. I tried calling him in September. His number was disconnected. I tracked down his firm's main line in Vancouver. The receptionist was polite. Mr. Henderson had requested that personal calls not be forwarded, but she could take a message. I said I was his brother. She said she understood, and those were still his instructions. I left my name and number. No one called back. Joe reached out through a university friend they'd had in common. The friend said Maxwell had mentioned he was stepping back from some family relationships and had asked people to respect that. Stepping back. That's how we described it to ourselves for the next 2 months. He's stepping back. He'll come around. The letter from the estate lawyer arrived in November. Our grandfather, Dad's father, had died 4 years earlier. He'd farmed grain near Moose Jaw for most of his adult life, and when Saskatchewan farmland values rose significantly through the late 90s and into the 2000s, he'd sold the land and invested the proceeds conservatively through a small trust. We knew that trust existed in the vague way something exists when you've never had to think about it directly. We assumed most of it had been distributed. Maxwell's condo down payment, maybe some other things over the years. It turned out the condo money had come from a separate account. The trust principal had stayed intact and kept growing. The letter was from an estate lawyer in Regina. Standard language, professional and impersonal. He was notifying me, as a named party, that I had been removed from the trust document. My parents had received similar letters. Maxwell had held full discretionary control since his 35th birthday, as written into the original terms. He had restructured the trust. It now designated a hospice organization in Saskatoon, a food bank in Regina, and a first-generation student bursary at the U of S as the primary recipients upon his death. Current estimated value of the trust, just over $1.1 million CAD. I read the letter 3 times. Joe read it twice. He planned this, she said quietly. I didn't answer. Of course he had. While he was finishing his weeks of polite dinners. While he was handing over a check we didn't need. While he was saying he understood. He'd already made every decision. He'd just been tying things up cleanly before he walked. Our parents were shaken. Dad called the number he had, disconnected. Mum sent an email to an old address. It bounced. We hadn't been a family that talked openly about money or inheritance, which meant we'd been carrying that trust as a silent safety net for years without acknowledging it out loud. Medical emergency. Job loss. Something going badly wrong in that unpredictable way. Things go badly wrong in the middle of your life. Maxwell had been the net we never named. Now he was a Saskatchewan hospice and a bursary fund for kids who'd be the first in their families to finish a degree. Which were good causes. That almost made it worse to think about. Daphne found part-time work at a marketing agency in October. She seemed better. Less time on the couch. More time making plans. Joe said she was starting to seem like herself again. Then in February, our next-door neighbor knocked on the door at 8 in the morning to tell us. Daphne had been in an accident on Crowchild Trail. She'd left a bar in Kensington at 2 in the morning and driven for home. No one else was hurt. Her car had clipped a concrete barrier on the off-ramp. The officer on scene recorded her blood alcohol as nearly twice the legal limit. We sat in the emergency waiting area at Foothills until 5 in the morning. Fractured wrist, bruised ribs, a cut along her forehead from the airbag. Nothing life-threatening. The DUI charge was real and would take months to work through. But the look on her face when we got into the room and she saw us, that specific hollowness, nothing left behind the eyes, told us the actual damage was somewhere a cast and stitches couldn't reach. It was all I kept thinking about, she said. Sitting there. What I did, what it cost everyone. I couldn't make it stop, so I just kept going. Joe held her hand. I sat in the chair in the corner and looked at the floor. Driving home in the gray Calgary dawn, Joe said, "We should try to reach Maxwell. He should know." I didn't argue. We'd both been circling it for weeks. The possibility that there was still a version of this where he knew what had happened and it changed something. Or at least where he called. We tried what we could first. I sent a carefully worded email to a project address I found through his firm's website. Nothing. Joe tried a different mutual contact. Nothing. I eventually did what I'd been putting off and hired a private investigator to find a current number. $500 in just over a week. He found Maxwell without difficulty. Same firm, Vancouver office. An address in East Vancouver. A new phone number. I called on a Tuesday evening, sitting in the driveway of my own house. Because I didn't want Joe to hear it go wrong. He answered. East? I hadn't prepared for that. I'd been ready for voicemail. Hearing his actual voice, level, the same as it had always been, made me lose the opening I'd had ready. "It's me," I said. I know a pause. "What happened?" I told him about Daphne. The accident, the hospital, the charge, the shape she was in. I told him she'd said his name in the hospital room. I told him Joe and I were worried and that I knew he owed us nothing and I was calling anyway. "Is she going to be okay physically?" he asked. "Yes, wrist ribs, she's healing." "Good." A pause. "Then there's nothing I can do about the rest." "Maxwell." "I heard everything you said." His voice didn't shift. "Daphne needs support. I hope she gets it. I hope you and Joe can be there for her. But it isn't my situation anymore. She's not the only reason I called. I miss talking to you." The silence stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I know you do," he said. "But you made a choice. You made it clearly and I accepted it. I've moved on. I'm genuinely fine. I'd appreciate it if you'd let that stand." He wasn't angry. That was the thing that got into me and stayed. He wasn't cold, wasn't clipped, wasn't punishing me with his tone. He was simply finished. "The trust," I started, "is handled. That's not a conversation." "Maxwell, that was Grandpa's money." "Yes." The only moment his voice shifted, barely. "And Grandpa left it to me because he believed I'd do something meaningful with it. I'd like to think I have. He wished me well. He asked me to give his best to Joe's family." He ended the call. When I tried back immediately, the number rang through to a voicemail inbox that hadn't been set up. Dad flew to Vancouver the following month. I gave him the East Van address. He waited outside the building on a Saturday morning for nearly 3 hours. Maxwell came out around noon in running gear, saw him on the sidewalk, and stopped. Dad told me about it that night on the phone, his voice flat and tired. "He wasn't unkind," Dad said. "He didn't say anything cruel. He just said, 'You always told me to be the reliable one. To show up, handle things quietly, not burden anyone.' I did that. When I needed someone to be reliable for me, I was told not to cause drama. So I didn't." And then he said he had a run to finish. Dad exhaled, and then he went. Joe and I wrote a letter that weekend. 3 drafts before we agreed it said what it needed to say. We sent it registered mail to his East Vancouver address. 6 weeks later I checked with Canada Post. Delivered and signed for. That was all we ever found out. No reply came. I found his LinkedIn profile by accident about a month later, a sidebar suggestion. Not something I'd searched for. He'd been promoted to principal engineer. There was a photo from a firm awards dinner. Maxwell in a dark blazer, laughing at something off frame. In the background of a second photo from the same event half out of the frame. A woman in a dark green dress was leaning slightly toward him. In the way people lean. When they're easy with each other. He looked well, not performing it. Actually well. Whatever he'd built in Vancouver in 2 years, the job, the flat, whatever that woman in the green dress was to him, It looked like a life that fit him. Joe looked at it with me. We sat with it for a while and then she closed the laptop. Good, she said. I mean it. Daphne completed her court program over the following months. Paid the fine. Did her community service hours. Attended the mandatory counseling sessions that she said, to her own visible surprise, were actually helping. The marketing position had let her go while she dealt with the legal side of things. She found steady work at a cafe in Bridgeland. She moved into a bachelor suite on the other side of the river in the spring. Older building, small kitchen but hers. She called Joe more now. Not about Maxwell, not about any of that. Just ordinary calls about her week, what she was reading. Whether Joe thought she should look into finishing her design degree part-time. Progress, real progress. I don't want to diminish it. But there are mornings when I sit at the kitchen table, earlier than I need to, and I understand. With a precision that isn't comfortable, exactly what we did. Joe's sister has a small apartment, and a job she shows up to, and a therapist she trusts, and that is worth something. It just isn't worth everything. We told Daphne she could stay while she sorted herself out, and we meant it kindly. But what we didn't do, what we had a clear chance to do and chose not to, was sit across from her that first night and plainly that what she'd done was wrong. That it had hurt someone real. That she was going to have to carry that honestly without us sanding the edges down for her. We gave her the impression that the right people would absorb what she'd done, so she didn't have to face the full weight of it. We thought that's what family does. I know now that what family actually does is say the hard thing because they're the ones who can, and because protecting someone from accountability isn't kindness. It's just a different kind of failure. Arrived at from a gentler direction. Maxwell had understood that. He'd always understood it. He understood it well enough to understand when we'd forgotten it, and he was right. Dad doesn't mention the trust anymore. Mom keeps old photos in an album in the living room, Maxwell in there among them, but she doesn't bring the album out much. We see Joe's parents on Sundays sometimes, Daphne included, and those dinners are quieter than they used to be. Not unhappy, just quieter. Nobody asks about Maxwell directly anymore. People ask how things are going and we say fine. And sometimes Joe mentions that her brother-in-law is in Vancouver doing well, and that's the end of it. Pride does strange things to the stories we tell about ourselves. You can understand precisely how you built your own loss, and still not be able to explain it to the person at the table who asks after your family. I looked at Maxwell's profile again a few weeks ago. Not searching for it. Same sidebar. He's listed as a speaker at an infrastructure conference in Calgary in the spring. I thought about whether to mention it to Dad. I decided not to. I know the version of events where that ends with Dad standing outside a convention center. The way he stood-eyed that building in East Van. And I'm not going to be the one who sets it in motion. Our grandfather's clock ticks in the hallway of Mom and Dad's house in Regina, and when I visit, which I do, because some things you hold on to harder after you've let others slip, I can hear it from the kitchen. Time doesn't pause to evaluate your decisions. It just moves, and the distance between what you did and what you could have done stretches a little further. Further each month until measuring it stops being useful. We chose wrong. Not for complicated reasons. Not out of malice. We chose wrong the way ordinary people choose wrong. Out of habit, out of comfort, out of not wanting that particular evening to get any harder than it already was. Out of looking at the person crying at our kitchen table and deciding that reaching out to her was easier than standing for the person who wasn't in the room. Maxwell didn't need us to agree with him. He needed us to be honest with him. We couldn't manage it, and he had the good sense not to wait around for us to try again. I think sometimes about whether he'll have children someday, whether they'll ever know my name, whether he'll mention, offhand, that he has a brother, or whether we'll have faded so completely out of the story he tells about his own life that we won't come up at all. I hope he's good. I hope whoever is standing in that photo in the dark green dress is good too. He was the most reliable person I've ever known, and he deserved to be treated like it mattered, and we didn't treat him that way. And he knew exactly what to do about that. He showed us what we were. We just never got the chance to thank him for it.